to the poor. The Hearsts agreed and set up food distribution points in San Francisco and Los Angeles. But it was chaos.
There was virtually no organization at any of the 4 distribution points. When the food lorry arrived here in a black ghetto of Oakland, the crowd, 20 times bigger than expected, took over. Some got inside and started throwing out to the spot, but from then on it was chaotic.
One policeman was stabbed and one man in the crowd was knocked unconscious. Carol Pogash had been assigned by the newspaper to follow the man hired by the Hearst to organize the food distribution program.
I remember being horrified because I was told to follow him, to spend time with him. I did, and that first day, rather than being at one of the sites and making sure everything was going as it should, he and I sat in a hotel restaurant and had eggs Benedict. and because it was the Hearst paper, that never got in.
So maybe that's why it was so chaotic.
I don't think he could have solved all the problems, but he may have been able to help.
It would be another year and a half before Patty Hearst was finally apprehended by the FBI and put on trial. She was sentenced to 7 years in prison for her part in the SOS crimes, but was released after 3. She was pardoned by President Clinton in 2001.
Louise Hidalgo was talking to Carol Pogash in 2010 for Witness History. You can hear more episodes of the programme by going to our website, bbcworldservice.com/Witness History.
This is the BBC World Service, and here's what World Book Club will be reading next.
We'll be talking with author Anne Patchett about her novel The Dutch House. It's a dark, modern fairy tale set in post-war America that traces the love between a brother and sister, their vanishing mother, distant father, and jealous stepmother. Spanning 5 decades, the story is told with a fine balance of wit and heartbreak.
World Book Club from the 2nd of March. In 30 minutes, World of Secrets, The Disciples.
With me, Yemisi Adegoke, and Charlie Northcott. Our investigation into Nigerian pastor TB Joshua concludes this week. For the first time, TB Joshua's daughter speaks out.
The newsroom is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
BBC World Service, it's 4 o'clock GMT. This is Oliver Conway with the newsroom. Republicans in Congress vote to impeach the Homeland Security Secretary in the latest political dispute over security at the Mexican border.
This is a big historic moment for House Republicans, but it will not go far. We do not expect much from the Democratic-controlled Senate.
Meanwhile, President Biden has called on Republicans to approve military aid for Ukraine. Indonesia's general election is underway with a controversial former general hoping to become president. People in occupied Ukraine forced to record apology videos after falling foul of the Russian authorities.
The text was just atrocious. It was the exact opposite of what I thought. It was designed to break me.
And political database.
It's been out for a year. We've had 10 engagements, 10 people, 10 couples getting married from the app. I actually went to the first wedding, which was this fall, and it was a lot of fun to see.
I'm Stuart McIntosh with BBC News. The US House of Representatives has voted to impeach President Biden's Homeland Security Secretary, Alejandro Mayorkas. Republicans accuse him of failing to enforce immigration laws, resulting in a record surge of migrants across the Mexican border. It's the first time in US history that a sitting cabinet secretary has been impeached. President Biden accused the Republicans of playing petty political games. Peter Bowles has more details.
After a failed attempt last week, the House voted by the slimmest of majorities, 214 to 213, to impeach Alejandro Mayorkas. President Biden called the vote a blatant act of unconstitutional partisanship and a political stunt. Be an impeachment trial in the Senate, which is controlled by the Democrats. A 2/3 majority is needed for it to succeed, and that's unlikely to happen.
President Biden has condemned comments by his predecessor Donald Trump in which the former president said he would encourage Russia to invade NATO allies that didn't spend enough on defense. Mr. Biden denounced the remarks as shameful, dangerous and un-American. The president was speaking after the US Senate approved a massive military aid package for Ukraine. The UN humanitarian coordinator Martin Griffiths has said an Israeli ground offensive in Gaza's southernmost city of Rafah will lead to slaughter. He said a military operation could put the fragile humanitarian effort to help displaced Palestinians at death's door. The spokesman for the UN Secretary-General, Stefan Dujarric, told the BBC the UN would not participate in forced evacuation.
It would take an enormous amount of work, and it would take a good amount of planning in peacetime. But you can imagine to do it in an active conflict zone and in areas where there are unexploded ordnances, where there are crumpled buildings that are not safe to use.
Indonesians are electing local and national politicians, including a new president, to replace Joko Widodo. It's billed as the largest and most complex one-day election in the world, with more than 200 million eligible voters spread across hundreds of islands. Indonesia's Defence Minister, Prabowo Subianto, is the frontrunner for president. Here's Jonathan Head.
He's a very controversial character. He's now 72 years old. He's also been aiming for the presidency for a very long time. He's a former Special Forces commander. He was for many, many years in the military. He has been accused of a whole array of human rights abuses in that capacity. He was the son-in-law of the authoritarian leader Suharto as well. But he has very much changed his image. He used to project a very hard nationalist, sometimes Islamic identity in his previous elections. He's turned that on his head, and he's coming to the voters very much as a kind of avuncular, older figure, which has really been very effective.
World News from the BBC. Israel has released video footage said to show the leader of Hamas in a tunnel under Gaza. A military spokesman, Daniel Hagari, said the video of Yahya Sinwar was taken 3 days after Hamas's deadly surprise attack on Israel on the 7th of October. The images are purported to be the first of him since the Israeli-Hamas war broke out. There's no independent confirmation of its veracity. The Australian state of Victoria is cleaning up after 2 disasters. Unpredictable fires are said to have destroyed dozens of homes in Western Victoria. One farmer was killed. Phil Mercer has this report.
While dangerous and unpredictable bushfires raged in Western Victoria, other parts of the Australian state were battered by severe storms. Trees fell onto houses, cars were crushed, and thousands of people left without power. It's not yet known how many properties were destroyed by the fires. Several major places are still burning, but favourable weather conditions are helping firefighters. All emergency warnings in Victoria have been lifted.
The Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, is in the United Arab Emirates to inaugurate a grand Hindu temple in the capital, Abu Dhabi. It's the first stone Hindu temple in the Muslim-majority countries of the Middle East. The inauguration will be the highlight of Mr. Modi's 2-day visit. He also met the UAE President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. Scientists say they've compiled the first detailed proof that great apes like to tease each other. Video studies of 4 species, bonobos, chimpanzees, gorillas and orangutans, show behaviour including surprise and play. The mostly one-sided teasing included hair pulling and poking. The international team of researchers say the evidence suggests that human-like antics could evolve from a common ancestor. That's the BBC News.
Thank you for listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service with Oliver Conway. The first time in 150 of representatives has impeached a member of the President's cabinet. Republicans accuse the Homeland Security Secretary, Alejandro Mayorkas, of failing to enforce immigration laws, thus allowing a record surge of migrants across the Mexican border. It was the Republicans' second attempt to impeach him after an embarrassing failure last week. Once again, it came down to a single vote.
The yeas are 214 and the nays are 213. The resolution is adopted.
But if the vote had come much later, it might have had a different result, as the Democrats now have an extra seat after winning a special election in the New York district that was held by a disgraced Congressman George Santos. Nevertheless, the results in the House today was a victory for Speaker Mike Johnson, ally of Donald Trump. President Biden called it a blatant act of unconstitutional partisanship. Mayorkas is unlikely to be convicted in the other chamber of Congress, the Senate. For more details on how Republicans have finally got it over the line in the House, we heard from Claudia Grisales, a congressional correspondent for NPR.
There were 3 Republicans who joined Democrats in its very narrowly controlled Republican chamber to block the effort to impeach Mayorkas last week. That said, Republicans were missing a key member. This is House Majority Whip Steve Scalise. He's been out battling cancer, and he was able to return to the House this evening, giving Republicans that 1-vote margin to be able to push this impeachment across the line. This is a big historic moment for House Republicans, also for House Speaker Mike Johnson. He's only a few months into his job. This is something that Republicans have been talking about ever since they took control of the House last year. And even before then, this was a major goal for them to go after Mayorkas. But it will not go far. We do not expect much from the Democratic-controlled Senate to do with this House action. Some raise concerns that this is going to become a back and forth between Democrats and Republicans to continue to impeach members of the opposing party.
Grisales of NPR. Staying in Washington, President Biden has hit out at Donald Trump over his lack of support for Ukraine, saying no other president in American history has bowed down to a Russian dictator. Putin. Early on Tuesday, the US Senate voted in favor of a $95 billion spending package for Ukraine, Israel and Taiwan. However, it also needs to pass the House of Representatives, and Speaker Johnson has rejected it. Speaking of the White House, President Biden called on the Republicans in the House to support American allies, saying history is watching.
Our nation stands at an inflection point in history, where the decisions we make now are going to determine the course of our future for decades to come. And I say to the House members, House Republicans, you got to decide. Are you going to stand up for freedom? Or are you going to side with terror and tyranny? You're going to stand with Ukraine? You're going to stand with Putin?
Republicans had previously said they wouldn't support money for Ukraine without funding for better security on the US-Mexican border. But when the Democrats agreed to do that, Trump loyalists torpedoed it. So will they do the same to this current bill? The question for our US correspondent, Peter Burks.
That is the key question, and the chances right now look quite slim. It passed in the Senate, controlled by the Democrats, quite easily, 70 votes to 29. 22 Republicans, including their leader Mitch McConnell, joined the other side of the aisle to approve the legislation. So bipartisan support, but none of what's contained in the bill is going to actually happen unless it is also passed in the House of Representatives, which has a slim Republican majority, unless they approve it. And only then can it head to the desk of Joe Biden to be signed into law. And the President, as we've just heard, is urging the House Speaker to bring the bill to the floor immediately, but it's quite possible the Speaker, Mike Johnson, could block it altogether. He said earlier that it wouldn't pass, and we've heard this several times, it wouldn't pass in the lower chamber of Congress without including money for security measures at the US southern border, which, as you reported, had been in an earlier version of the bill.
Yeah, Republicans in the House of Representatives seem to be more loyal to Donald Trump compared to the Senate. What do you make of the fact that some in the Senate defied Mr. Trump by voting for this bill, and why is Donald Trump so opposed to it?
Well, I think it just illustrates the divide that exists still in the Republican Party. They don't all support the Trump vision of the world. The former president is leading this battle to fund security measures for the border and has been increasingly vocal about it, opposing support for Ukraine because he sees it as either or. I think that's the easiest way to sum up what he believes. It's this America First philosophy that Donald Trump has been campaigning on. He always did, and it has strong support from the right of the party. It is not, though, as you imply, shared universally by Republicans. Mitch McConnell, who I've mentioned, example today, he said, on the value of American leadership and strength, today history will record that the Senate did not blink. Then we've got people like Rand Paul disagreeing, siding with Donald Trump, saying, shouldn't we try to fix our own country first?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned America First. President Biden, in his comments, also condemned Mr. Trump's recent suggestion He would encourage Russia to invade NATO countries that didn't spend enough on defence. What do Americans make of it?
Yeah, well, the President said shameful, un-American, responding to those comments of Mr. Trump. Americans, from my own scientific polling of opinion, increasingly Americans come down on these issues according to where their basic allegiances lie. In other words, Trump supporters support the rhetoric, as some on the other side see it. Democrats despise it. They say it's another example of unhinged Donald Trump. And there's also a group that simply shrugs their shoulders and they say, well, that's Donald Trump. What he's saying is extreme, but maybe he doesn't really mean it. It's more about, some suspect, getting headlines than writing a political manifesto.
He's talking to us from Los Angeles. Palestinians in Rafah are, quote, staring death in the face, so says the UN aid chief Martin Griffiths, as Israel gears up for a ground invasion of the southern city on the Egypt border. About half of Gaza's population is currently packed into Rafah. The UN says there's nowhere left for them to flee to, despite Israel saying it will give them safe passage. Mediators met in Egypt on Tuesday to try to promote a ceasefire agreement for Gaza. They ended without a breakthrough. As I heard from our chief international correspondent, Lisa said.
Well, the Israeli media are saying that the head of Mossad, the Israeli spy chief, has left Cairo. But what we are hearing about this latest round, which includes the US, Egyptian, Israeli spy chiefs, as well as the Qatari Prime Minister, is that the mood was described as positive. That came from an Egyptian source. Americans are saying they're moving in the right direction, but there are still said to be wide gaps. And there is a report on CBS News tonight quoting an official saying that one of the gaps is how many Palestinians detained, arrested, kept in Israeli jails could be exchanged. Israeli men and most of all Israeli soldiers. Then they had been asking, for example, for women hostages or children. So that seems to be a sticking point. But only really the big gap is what Hamas and Israel are prepared to accept. We hear that Hamas is insisting on an end to the war, whereas Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu said that's delusional, in his words, and the war will only end with, again to use his words, when we have achieved total victory over Hamas.
Now, the UN aid chief says military operations in Rafah could lead to a slaughter in Gaza. What will happen to civilians? Is there any way for them to get out? We are hearing reports that some have already fled as a result of the latest Israeli attacks there.
Yes, so this is the long dark shadow that is now hanging over these truce talks. The possibility, in fact it seems that a military operation by Israel into the last area of Gaza where its troops have not operated significantly on the ground in Rafah is in the planning stages. President Biden has been speaking about that this week after his talks with the King of Jordan and said he does not want Israel to make a military move into Rafah until there is what he calls a credible plan to take care of civilians. There are said to be about 1.4 million Gazans there. Most of them have been displaced time and again from other parts of the Gaza Strip. Most are living in tents, which is why the United Nations, right up to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, is saying it's impossible to have a military operation in Rafah. It would be a humanitarian nightmare. And yes, we are getting reports that some Gazans are saying they're going to go back to their homes, what's left of their homes, in the north of Gaza, because they say we don't want to die in a tent. But that's the problem, Ollie, is that whole neighborhoods have been erased that are now just mounds of rubble after these months of Israeli military operations, and many are saying there's nowhere for Gazans to go. There are reports coming tonight, one of them on the Wall Street Journal, saying that first details are emerging of an Israeli plan to create a kind of tented city in southwestern Gaza. What we've heard so far from the United Nations is that they simply don't have the means to up sticks in Rafah, where they are based now, to move more than 1 million Gazans. And they're still saying it's It's just beyond our means and beyond imagination.
Our chief international correspondent, Elise Doucette. You're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. The world's biggest single-day election is underway in Indonesia, with nearly 260,000 candidates standing for 20,000 posts. The presidential race pits two former governors against Prabowo Subianto, a former military chief in the Suharto dictatorship. He is the front-runner despite accusations of human rights abuses in the 1990s. He's been rebranded on social media as a cuddly grandpa and has the implicit support of the popular current president, Joko Widodo, who served the maximum 2 years. Earlier, I asked our Southeast Asia correspondent Jonathan Head how voting was going amid reports of flooding.
Yeah, it's been very wet here in the capital, Jakarta. That has posed some logistical challenges in a few places, but remember the size of Indonesia. It covers an area equivalent to continental United States, so large parts of the archipelago. It's not the weather that's the problem, it's just the business of getting there. There are some very, very remote places where voting is going on. Indonesia has done it very well in the past. I've no doubt they'll accomplish it pretty quickly here. The voting only lasts for 6 hours. Huge numbers of polling stations, and then the count will start. I would expect turnout to be high because people just believe in voting here, and they've always come out in the past.
Yeah, and what is at stake for Indonesia? Quite a big change after 10 years of Joko Widodo.
Yes, I mean, he's been a remarkably popular and effective president. I mean, in some ways a brilliant politician with a kind of big tent politics, a very mild manner, brings everybody in. He's managed to avoid a lot of the conflicts that used to plague Indonesia and really zeroed in on big-ticket development projects, infrastructure, which the country really needed, a lot of showcase stuff. After 10 years, the front-runner is this former Special Forces General, Prabowo Subianto. He's a very controversial character, and he's been ahead for 3 to 4 months. So I think a lot of people are thinking, well, given his character and his very different style, we'll probably get a very different direction. In policy terms, all three of the presidential candidates have essentially said they're going to continue this moderate focus on development. So I don't think the voters are expecting a radical change in direction, just perhaps a big change in leadership style.
There's some suggestion, though, that if General Prabowo wins, he might roll back some of the rights that emerged following the end of the dictatorship back in the 90s.
I think a lot of people fear that. He's a mercurial character, all those human rights abuses against him. But more than that, in his long campaign to become president, he's been trying to do it for 20 years now. He's often expressed very anti-democratic sentiments, a belief that these Western-style values don't apply to Indonesia, and actually quite a lot of concern about the way that under President Jokowi, the democratic institutions that came in after the authoritarian Suharto era have been chipped away at. President Jokowi himself has wanted to kind of push through this development agenda. Because he's had very little opposition, he's brought everyone into his big tent. There hasn't been much debate, and even when people have criticised, often quite harsh laws have been used to silence them. So I think for a lot of people, democracy's been slipping here anyway, and they expect that trend to continue if Prabowo Subianto wins, as many people expect he will.
Jonathan Head in the Indonesian capital, Jakarta. Since Russia invaded Ukraine nearly 2 years ago, videos have appeared online showing Russians apologising for various alleged offences frowned on by the Kremlin. Now it's started happening in occupied parts of Ukraine, with some residents forced to record apology clips after expressing pro-Ukrainian views. This report from Vitaly Shevchenko, Russia editor at BBC Monitoring.
At the very end of last year, a private party was held at a nightclub in Moscow, where guests, some of them big pop stars, were told to appear almost naked. In the current climate of the war in Ukraine, they were condemned as unpatriotic, and soon enough, they started issuing videos full of remorse.
Говорят, Россия умеет прощать. Если это так, я бы очень хотела попросить второй шанс.
Such clips are part of a culture of apology videos, which have increased in number since the invasion almost 2 years ago. Now, this practice has spread to occupied parts of Ukraine. For example, in Donetsk, one woman was forced to record an apology video after posting pro-Ukrainian views and Ukrainian songs online. To protect her identity, we'll call her Nina, and her words are spoken by someone else. This is how she describes a visit to her home by local Russia-backed security officers.
They said, well, look, we can be rude and we can be cruel to you. We can bundle you up in a boot now and take you wherever we want.
After being interrogated and threatened by the police, Nina was handed a piece of paper with the apology she was supposed to read.
The text was just atrocious. It was the exact opposite of what I thought. They wanted me to say that I support Russia, that Donetsk could flourish as part of Russia, that Ukrainian troops are criminals, fascists, and so on.
The final straw was when the security officers threatened to send Nina to jail and her child to an orphanage.
That's when I started crying. Was this just a police intimidation tactic and they won't actually do it? Or did they mean it? It was certainly within their power.
In the end, Nina recorded the apology video the police wanted. The experience left her devastated.
I felt my soul being raped. They were trying to break, disgrace, and humiliate me. Worst of all, I felt defeated.
So why is this happening?